my screen. There we go. Okay, super. So thanks so much for coming today. This is our next in the series of Design Excellence for our Lunch with Larry series. Got a half an hour slated today. I hope you like the subject. It's going to be centered around model-based systems engineering. And we've got a couple Siemens experts on the line today. We're going to talk about systems engineering. And so I'll just start out with my typical slide to say who I am. I'm Lawrence Sampson, so I'm responsible for medical device business processes here at Siemens. And this is just a little bit of discussion about me, just a few links to get to different artifacts, LinkedIn if you want to talk, my phone number. In addition to that, we have a Scan Me QR code. So this is for this registration for this session. So if you want to provide this to one of your colleagues to come, we'd love to have them along as well. As we go into new sessions, we'll have new webinar series and have new QR codes, but this is the one for design excellence, and we're talking through a variety of different design authoring topics. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. We got a lot of great content today, so if you, we'll have another slide at the end. If you want to get this QR code, you can certainly do that at that time. Just wanted to chat about our survey results from last week. We were tracking week over week level of interest, so I think we're okay. Last week I was I was pretty happy actually with the number, just because we had a general topic session last time, and people seem to still appreciate the content. So hopefully this time we'll have a little more value for you. So excited about this conversation. Just a quick note about our open ventilator project. We're building a complete solution across our portfolio related to an open ventilator data set that we're building out. This is the portion of it that we're talking about today with the systems engineering is going to be a model that's built directly around this ventilator project. So it's a ventilator model, and so hopefully this will start the process of talking about our design processes. Where do we start a design process? Usually we'll start it at the systems engineering point, and so this is really the beginning of the design authoring process. Just to talk a little bit about value, this last discussion we had, we talked about these 3 points of value. In this session, we're really going to be talking about the first point, which is really world-class design tools. How is it that what kind of tools should we bring into the process? How are those tools disseminated, and how are they linked, and how do the data models move together? So this one is one of the tools that we start the process with. So the first value is the one we're going to talk about. Of course, the other ones, just as a review, are integration of those design tools. So once we finish with this model, we'll be talking about how it integrates into system simulation and then into the authoring of the design. And then, of course, complexity management is all about data models and how this all builds into a bill of materials that you can progress into your manufacturer BOM. And of course, the result is design innovation. So this is where we're heading with the discussion today. Very excited about it. And so we're going to just go ahead and jump into a Q&A session this time. It's going to be a little different format than the last ones that we've had. And the point of it is really to get your hands down into the tools. I'd like this to be a pretty technical session. And so the two guests that we're going to have today are Mark Sampson, who's a product manager for our systems engineering group, and Tony Komar, who is our model-based systems engineering evangelist. And so both these guys are going to give you a lot of context. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start out with a question. And we'll start with Mark. You know, why is systems modeling important in a development process and the design and construction of the digital thread? So Mark, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and maybe provide us some feedback. And I'm going to, you had a couple slides for the question. I'm going to go ahead and show those for the audience. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. I guess to get to the cut to the chase on this, because products are becoming so complex, it's that the combinations of hardware, electrical, software, and so forth that have led to the really big problems, and these problems surface at the combination. So I think probably the best way to get across to you why this is important is maybe to share an example. It turns out that automotive is a good place to look for these examples of these cross-domain kinds of problems that are surfacing, because there's so many of them, and it's in the public domain. So in 2018, those of you in the US I'm sure I could probably ask for a raise of hands, and you guys would all, number of you would raise your hands. There was some 47 million of these product recalls out there. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates it's something like $100 per recall per vehicle. So you can imagine that's a lot of money, $4.7 billion last year that was spent on this problem. So let's see if you guys are good at seeing the cross-disciplinary problem as you look at this actual recall. You're looking at a picture of a recall. I'll give you a second to kind of digest this. What do you think the recall is, or what the problem was here as you look at this? Okay, let's go on to the next slide here for those of you that maybe have some opinions about this. Well, what happened is that the ergonomics people decided to place the, you see the drive selection switch right next to the console there, the screen and the radio. And what was happening is people, as they're cruising down the road, reach over to turn on or off the radio, and they turn on or off the vehicle. They're turning off the vehicle, which of course locks all the steering wheels and turns off all the safety systems and everything else that goes along with it. So now, as you look at this, now that you've experienced this, we're never going to do this one again because we know better than that next time. But the problem is a lot of these lessons are lost, and we end up repeating them. In fact, we found that in the automotive industry, they repeat of over about a 3-year period. So the point we're trying to get here is these cross-domain problems is where all the problems is, and we're after trying to prevent them and solve those before they become a big problem. So hopefully that gets the point across, Larry. Okay?
Yeah, that's terrific. So this transfers us directly into the model discussion that we're going to have with the ventilator project. And I guess now what I'm going to do is go ahead and move over to Tony Komar, and we're going to have him display his screen and talk a little bit about these models. So Tony, maybe you can provide a quick description of this systems model and let me know when you show your screen. Okay, so everybody hopefully can see Tony's screen now. And you could provide a quick description of this systems model for this open ventilator project and help our audience understand how the modeling work relates to an actual ventilator project. So how does this tool work, and maybe you can kind of walk us through how this model is constructed.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that, Larry. What I'll do first is I'm basically going to orient us. We're going to talk through the different phases of this type of modeling. So we're going to have operational analysis, system analysis, logical architecture, physical, and EPBS. The operational is basically helping define what the problem is. And so there are a lot of modeling tools. This is a very important part because I got to understand the problem. System analysis is about understanding what's in my scope and what's not in my scope. And then logical and physical architecture starts getting into detailing out what the architecture is. So what I'm going to do is jump right into the tool here because I have a dislike for PowerPoints. And I'll actually show you what that kind of looks like in a modeling tool. So operational analysis, as I mentioned, this is the tool we're using. It's called System Modeling Workbench. And what it does is it walks you through these different phases. So operational analysis being the first one. The first thing you might do is figure out, well, what capabilities does the system have to have? In this case, it's a ventilator system. And these are the different operational capabilities, everything from basically installing it, that you see here, to connecting the patient to it, to actually delivering the ventilation, and then, various things that you have to do with the hospital call system may be integrated to it, and also monitoring in status. So that's some of the basic capabilities that you would see. But these capabilities are connected together as a flow. It's almost like a process that they actually have to go into when you're doing working with a product. So in this case, I'm going to show this is kind of the flow of activities that you would typically have. So I'm showing here basically clinicians in the room, establishes the operating modes of the system, connects it to the patient, basically delivers the ventilation, and the ventilation, it converts basically the air to blood oxygen. You monitor the patient's respirations, you monitor the patient's vitals, you're doing that, clinicians doing that. So I'm kind of getting a scope of what the problem is here. I'm trying to understand how a ventilator would be used. And then I'll monitor its operational status. The interesting thing was we reviewed this model with actually a clinician working with COVID-19 yesterday, and an interesting thing came out of it is that a big issue that they're actually having with the ventilators is now putting on and off PPE. So I actually created this derivation of that same diagram showing that because of you're replacing a nurse that used to look like this with a nurse or a doctor, respiratory therapist that looks like that, with all the gown and the equipment. And so that was some feedback that we got on this operational analysis that it's a bigger problem right now because of this contagious disease, which requires you to put on all this materials to do the operation. So that's what operational analysis is about. I'll go quickly to the next one, which is basically the next phase would be system analysis. Everything's coming across okay, Larry? You can see this pretty well?
Yeah, everything's great. One of the questions I was going to ask as we go through here is the output of this is functions, right? So isn't that
exactly
the point?
So those operational activities that we saw there are actually the things that turn into functions. So in this view here, we actually start calling them functions, and these green boxes that you're seeing are the actual functions. And as you noticed in the previous slide, there was some different flows. One was deliver ventilation. I'm showing those flows now as different colors on here. So for instance, right here, the double limb vent operation is shown by the orange bars that are going through here, delivering it. I have the deliver AC mode going on, different colors. So I actually am showing flows through the system. So I'm basically starting and stop the vent. I basically deliver the AC mode. I delivered the ventilation through a double limb configuration, basically depicted here kind of in this graphic. And then it basically is involving the patient, which converts the blood to oxygen. And then I'm even showing a closed path back of delivering vitals back to the clinician that's in the room. And notice that the flow there is outside the system. So the system being this big blue box right here in the middle is the ventilator. So this step is all about deciding what problem I'm going to solve with the system and what problems are going to be outside of it. Essentially, delivering vitals, I'm basically going to leave outside of the problem, but basically running the ventilator, doing the different steps, setting the configurations, even the call interface is part of, in this instance, the ventilator. So that's really where functions begin, and these are system functions. They're not basically been allocated out to any part of the system. And that's really what the next phase is about. So this is kind of saying, okay, these two phases that we just went through are all about the problem. And now we get into the solution, the place that most of us engineers really enjoy. So here what I'm doing is I'm now opening up the ventilation model for what we call the logical architecture, where now we're actually starting to show the ventilator. This is the ventilation system here. Now I'm starting to identify different components. In this case, the ventilator. Inside the ventilator, there's going to be a user interface. There's going to be a controller. There's going to be an exhalation valve. You're going to see basically a housing, O2 interface. You're going to see here an inhalation air generator. So basically, that's going to be the compressor. You see the air coming into the system, and essentially the air going outside the system to the patient, where the blood oxygen basically is the air is being used to convert to oxygen. And again, that's that. And then there's the feedback path through here for the vitals.
So from an allocation standpoint, Tony, could we then now can we start assigning these functions to different disciplines as an example, or how do you use the function?
Yes, this is kind of where the starting point, but this is also the point where you would start doing some modeling. You start thinking about modeling the whole problem. Now that I know this is kind of the flow that I want to do, and I want to start figuring out things of sizing, let's say the compressor. I want to start understanding how this may display back to the user. I start wanting to start getting some of that feedback information. I start at this point kind of basically doing some logical modeling. Maybe I'm even introducing some failure mode modeling, where I'm starting to now look at the system to find out whether where my problems may be from a safety aspect. But this is really the beginning of figuring out what the hardware is that I'm going to use. And when we go into the physical phase, that's really where we start mapping it to actual hardware. Okay. I'll go into the physical. Now in the physical aspect is really now where I'm starting to figure out what am I going to build the system out of. So in this instance here, I'll just do a quick view of this. This is kind of an very high level view of the ventilator. There's the ventilator. It has a couple PCBAs, printed circuit board assemblies. There's one for the main CPU, the LCD keyboard. There's a buzzer. There's actually a turbine control board. There's a turbine assembly. This is very high level. These are the items that would basically make up the system. At this point, we want to start mapping these items to behaviors that they have to have in functions. And so in this view, I just have a simple view of what the parts are. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive here into one section where I'm basically now going to show, here's the CPU PCBA. Inside of it has some ventilator software, and this is the ventilator software function that's going to be done here. And this is the drive motor control board. So this is a CPU I/O. It's going to drive the motor control board. Here's basically the turbine control PCA. It's going to actually have motor control. And then the turbine is going to generate the airflow. So I'm basically deep diving into the physical and what functions they're being delivered. And at the same time, I'm keeping some traceability. The power of the model is I'm keeping traceability back to that logical view of where things came from, because all these functions that you're seeing here basically came from the higher level logical model. So in this case, I can sit on the function and I can see where it was in the logical view of the system. So it was also called control ventilation at the logical view. I can then go to that control ventilation at the logical view and actually see where that came from all the way back into the system function view. So I can keep tracing the functionality back to the higher level system, and I have basically a complete model of how you got from the operational analysis and the system functions all the way down to the physical functions of how they've been implemented and assigned to various components or allocated to various components.
Sure. So maybe what you could do, could you maybe show us how this all relates to the patient physiology? So maybe make it a little more clear how the model is related to patient physiology.
Yeah. So the model here, probably the cleanest view, the beginning of that view is basically in the system analysis, in the logical architecture view here, is that the patient physiology is converting the ventilator oxygen to air. And so you would want to basically simulate or basically create a model that could show how the ventilator, and its compressor, air inhalation generator down here, inhalation air generator, how that compressor basically produces air, goes to the patient, that the patient has to, and that's where you might have to have a model of the patient to basically see what the behavior is. There's going to be certain signals that come back from the patient. In this case, they're actually monitoring devices that are actually happening here on the hoses on the circuit. That's actually being fed back, and it's basically sensing the patient's exhalation right here, the exhales, and that information then gets shown back on the respirator here. But that having a model of the patient is really important, because then that allows you to actually develop test cases for the system that you would want to basically validate at the point when you actually have physical hardware. So you start with a model to generate the data and to create the test cases, and then you'll actually use the real hardware at some point to validate the test cases.
Sure. So if we're going to, so next week's session is going to be about system simulation. So would we take these functions then and flesh them out in math in that simulation program, or is that how we would drive the simulation?
Yep. In many cases, you would actually use tools that can model different pieces of hardware, such as compressors. Other ones you may have models, 1D model that would represent the circuit that you have for basically connects the patient to the ventilator. And then there's even the possibility of developing model of the patient itself. Differential equations are pretty common for doing that. I ran into one white paper recently that had that, so you could model it in various tools. But one of our common ones is AIMSIM that we use for this type of modeling, and it's a good candidate. I think you're going to be talking about that one.
Yeah. So, for example, the lungs, we'd want to have maybe stiffness of the lungs or some other characteristics of the lungs to be able to create that model, I would guess.
Yeah, and you may even want one if it was able to have one that actually has a disease or a progression of a disease. That might be helpful too, to just determine whether you could do some more advanced understanding of what might happen. Like essentially, having an idea of what the vitals and how they may change, or maybe even how the feedback on the respiration may change based on a healthy patient or an unhealthy patient. As you make a more complex or richer product, you may want to be able to use that model to help the respiratory therapist know if the patient's improving or not improving, and knowing what to expect is part of that. And modeling is a huge part of that.
Sure. Well, maybe I can go in a little bit of a different direction. So in med device, we're required to be compliant with ISO 62304, which is really software lifecycle management for medical device software. And in the standard, we're required to provide a software architecture document. And this is discussed in the document as a hierarchical model. So they talk about systems and items and units. So it's sort of a nested bill of materials kind of view of it. And it's always seemed sort of restrictive to me in the view of its architecture. So I guess part of what my question is there a way that we can use systems modeling to drive the systems architecture diagram and provide better, richer content for software designers and regulators? A way to do that?
Yep. You definitely can do that. I mean, this particular application is very good at doing both software and hardware modeling. And you can see here that I've done mostly that. But you can go in to actually start detailing out, let's say, the software that the system needs to do. In this case, I've actually started detailing out some inner workings of what the software functionality would have to be that's going to be in that controller model. Basically identifying the different sub-functions that have to be developed. And in a way, think of this as kind of the requirements, as supplementing the specifications of what the software needs to do. Eventually, this functionality gets allocated down to a physical model. So if I go over to the physical models, especially the one of the physical, I'm going to go in and look at the turbine model here. Here I actually have identified a component called ventilator software. This is what we would call a behavior component. I've tagged that component as basically, I can go in here and I can tag that as software. Yep. And then that software, then I could actually either continue developing the model here, or I could essentially create a submodel to go and just work on the software part of the problem. And essentially the process that you just seen me go through here, and basically making subparts of the system, but basically kind of a hardware system, I can do that same process by doing that at basically a software level. So here, this is the steps that I would take to do that. I can actually create a submodel just dedicated to software, and I can push the button, and it's going to actually allow me to do that. Just to speed things along a little bit, I'll just show what that model would look like. Here's the software model, and essentially the same tools that we had doing this model, you have to basically go off and do the software model. In this case, I'm starting now with just the ventilator software. This is what the software would do. It shows the keypads as a outside the system, the LCD, the CPU I/O board here, and now I can start decomposing the functions that the software needs to have and develop, and that basically allocate them to different components that may be inside of the software. So I can basically do that same type of structure and hierarchy inside the software. And that's actually then a submodel. Nice thing about that is that many times people outsource the software development. I've just created a model that I can give to somebody else to just work on the software.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that question. So if using this method to sort of declutter the model, could we use it to drive our suppliers, right? So we have a hardware supplier or software or some combination of a sub-assembly. How can we use this to drive our suppliers?
Yeah, absolutely. You could handle this to the supplier as kind of, this is what you need to give me. The supplier then could take this model and go through the same phases that we went through earlier, develop out a logical, a physical representation of it, and actually detail out, in very great detail what the software needs to do. And hopefully we're not trying to replace tools that people may already be using for algorithm development. I think tools like MATLAB and Simulink, which people tend to use, but this gives them the starting point for those tools, where I can start thinking about the problem as a big picture and then allow them to connect into those products. But there is also a way that I can take this software and turn it into a component and actually include it back into the higher level model if I wanted to do that, and actually replace the model with a library component of the software. So it's basically top down or bottom up.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Top down or bottom up? Didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No problem.
So there's a question that said, in the context of 62304, is there any exporting functionality to some sort of document? How would you create a document to provide this communication with suppliers? That was the question.
Well, there's a couple ways. I mean, one way is that this information can be stored back into the PLM system. So I'll just show that here. And while I'm doing that, there's also a way to actually, there's a tool set that allows you to generate documents from the model. So we've basically got two options. We can generate documents from the model, and then those documents can be configuration controlled. It generates Word type documents. The other option is that the information that was in the model also can be saved to Teamcenter, and then it can actually be used and navigated through and looked at inside of Teamcenter. So in this case, I just logged in to it. It actually opened up a window, an active workspace inside the modeling tool. And inside of here, I have essentially all the diagrams that we were looking at earlier. They basically have been published. Also, there's representations of all the different components. The logical architecture and the functional architecture is basically depicted here. But that's really then also a starting point of where you can make connections to downstream. But with the need to produce certain documentations, sometimes you have to take little steps. Sometimes you have to produce the document from the model as people gain faith in the model. And then as time goes along, you can actually start exposing the model directly for people to look at.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to Mark here and just have a quick conversation about an example of a company that has implemented a system like this. So Mark, maybe you can give us an example to make this a little more tangible from a customer standpoint. If you're off mute, of course. Did we lose Mark?
Sorry, Larry, I've got myself on mute here. Are you sharing your screen?
I am.
Okay, so as you guys have been looking at this thing, you've seen lots of moving pieces, and coordinating all these different pieces turns out to be a huge communication problem. And it turns out that that's the source of many of your expensive overruns and so forth. So if you could actually solve this communication problem with this architecture that Tony's talking about, that means that we have a great opportunity here to reach some pretty huge benefits. So here's an example real quick for you guys that comes from the aerospace business. You're looking at all the subsystems associated with a 787 aircraft. You can see there's lots of them. And in fact, there's millions of interfaces in this. If you get on an airplane like the 787, there's millions of interfaces that have to be managed and coordinated and so forth and so on. So if you can click on to a next build here real quick, what we found is that they realized they needed to keep a handle on all this stuff. So what they built using our solutions is they took all these interfaces and they did this functional architecture that Tony described to you. And those functional architectures now show connections between all the different elements that are performing different aspects of it. And what they did is they just merely put in a publish and subscribe system. So anytime one of these interfaces along these functions changed, everybody along that chain who were going to be consuming that information were notified. And when they were notified, it went to the point using our PLM solutions that went to the point of demanding a response and what they were going to do about it and so forth and so on, and then even offered the opportunity to propose changes. But anyway, the bottom line here is because when they reached the integration as far as first flight is concerned, which is kind of the ultimate test, what you're looking at here in this graph is 3 examples of 3 different airplanes. The one you see here with the tall spikes here in kind of the mauve color is 777. On first flight, it experienced 16,000 integration problems that have to be resolved. They said that that was a year and a half of schedule to get that taken care of. The zeros you see here are 787. 787 had 0 integration problems on first flight. So they would claim that it saved at least a year and a half of their project schedule to be able to do that. And that's the value you get from keeping everybody on the same page for this product architecture that we're talking about. So hopefully that helps you a little bit, Larry.
Yeah, super. I think it really makes sort of why this is so important. It's just critically important to a good development process. So I'm going to go ahead and try to respect everyone's time here, go on to the end stage. Our next one is going to be system simulation, and we're going to show how to drive this process through into the design. So how is it that we take this modeling effort and start to drive system simulation as a result of that? So that's the next session. It's going to be with Alex Francois Sincere, and really looking forward to that. And again, here's the scan me if you want to register for the thing. And just want to say thank you so much for coming today. Hope you enjoyed your lunch with Larry. We'll talk to you soon.